Welcome to this lecture on the peace sphere, the sphere of peace. I'm Dale Snowart, professor of peace studies at the University of Toledo. The purpose of this presentation is to further explore and elaborate the nature of the sphere of peace. Peace has two basic dimensions. One is its meaning, its value. What is the nature of peace? And then secondly, the second dimension is the sphere of peace, which refers to the space within which peace is enacted. This lecture is an attempt to explore and further elaborate the nature of this sphere of peace. To that end, a framework will be explored for understanding the sphere of peace, and this framework is based upon the historical analysis of Daron, Acemoglu, and James Robinson in their book, The Narrow Corridor, State, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty. In that analysis and within that framework, they demonstrate that a balance of power between the state, defined as the government, and the society, defined as the people, creates a narrow corridor of liberty. And the dynamics of the creation and maintenance of this corridor occurs within the framework of a balanced power relation between state and society. The right balance of power between the state, that is the government and its institutions, and the elites that control them, those institutions, and society, defined as the people as citizens. The core thesis of the presentation is that one way of understanding the sphere of peace is that the corridor of liberty is necessarily a space of justice, and thus a corridor of positive peace. The main point of identifying the sphere of peace as a balanced structure of state power relations, state-society power relations, is to point out that informed and engaged citizens are necessary, necessary participants in the pursuit of peace and justice. So the sphere of peace refers to the level of society, local, national, international, or global, and perhaps more fundamentally, the existence of a public sphere existing that creates a society. Following the philosopher John Dewey, we can define the public or suggest that the public is created by the interaction of two or more persons, which has indirect consequences for others. Dewey writes that, quote, the lasting, extensive, and serious consequences of associated activity bring into existence a public. That is, the public is a body of individuals, of citizens, of persons who are impacted by the consequences of each other's action and interaction. And those impacted, the body of individuals who are impacted by the action of others, have a common interest in the regulation of the consequences of that action. So when two or more people interact, they have direct consequences in that interaction towards each other. But significantly, their interaction may cause indirect consequences for others not directly involved in the interaction. Like, for example, dumping toxic waste in a river, which is then carried downstream that affects others. The consequences of that interaction create a public, and there is a common interest in the regulation of that public. Although the existence, although a public is created by the consequences of action, and although the public has a shared interest in the regulation of those consequences, the public is often unorganized, unaware of the cause of those consequences, and unable to regulate those consequences. So the existence of a public sphere interaction of many individuals that creates the public. The question arises: how is the public to be regulated in the interest of all, in the common interest? The regulation of the public requires the impartial enactment and enforcement of the law by the state, which in turn requires the exercise of coercive power to ensure compliance. And that enforcement of the law creates trust among the people and makes possible social cooperation among them. This idea in its modern form can be traced back to Thomas Hobbes, who argued that the state as a coercive power is the only actor capable of guaranteeing compliance to the law, thus providing social order. And here we have the origins of a conception of the modern government, of the modern state, that it's the state that enacts and enforces the law, and through that enactment and enforcement, social order, the regulation of the public in the common interest, is ideally achieved. Establishing that social order therefore requires that citizens enter into a social contract with the state, with an authoritative, coercive power that can guarantee social order through its exercise of political power. And that exercise includes the utilization of force when needed. The problem with the coercive power of the state, that is the Leviathan, is that while the power and authority of the state is a necessary condition for an ordered society, and thus for peace and justice, if left unchecked, it will become despotic. It will lead to domination and oppression. It will result in structural and cultural violence. So if the state left to its own devices without being checked, it is very likely that it will lead to despotism and domination. So a fundamental political question arises: can coercive state power be checked, thereby preventing despotic domination? One very important and prominent answer to that question is that the power of the state can be checked internally, checked and balanced internally through the adoption of a constitutional architecture that divides power, referred to often as Matsuonian division of power. To quote the problem, to quote Madison, is, quote, "in forming a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and then the next place oblige it to control itself." That is the fundamental question of control, of checking and balancing. And Madison's, the American Federalists' answer to the question of how to check power was prominently among them, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, was that a constitutional architecture could be constructed that divides power vertically among various jurisdictions. This is called federalism, city, county, state, and federal. And also within each of those levels, you would divide power constitutionally through the establishment of independent branches of government, the legislature, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And thus, through the division, this is an application of the divide and rule principle. It's an axiom of tyranny, but was utilized by the Federalists to create a constitutional framework for a republic to be administered on just principles. So one answer to the question of the Leviathan's power, of checking the Leviathan's power, is to establish a constitutional architecture of checks and balances that divides power within the government itself. However, a constitutional system of divided state power alone is insufficient to curb the power of the Leviathan. Jefferson suggested, quote, "What country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance?" Jefferson is suggesting that an informed citizenry is needed to control, regulate, and condition the despotic power of the state. This is based upon the belief that the purpose of government is to secure the rights of the citizens, and that the government power is derived from the consent of the government. And we will discuss this further. As Acemoglu and Robinson suggest, quote, despotism flows from the inability of society, that is the people, to influence the state's policies and actions. Though a constitution may specify democratic elections or consultation, such a decree is insufficient to make the Leviathan responsive, accountable, and shackled unless society is mobilized and becomes actively engaged in politics, end quote. So not only do we need a constitutional system that divides power, we need an engaged and informed citizenry to check the coercive power of the state. Citizens are needed to control, regulate, and condition the coercive power of the state. And this power, the power of citizens, the democratic empowerment of citizens, paves the way to the shackled Leviathan, a situation, a state of affairs where state power, governmental power, is constrained by an informed and politically engaged citizenry. As Dewey suggested, the public must recognize itself in order to articulate and express its interests. If the state is to protect the common good and not merely be a handmaiden of elite private interest, it must be informed by the public. That is, it must be informed and controlled by the citizenry. It is an engaged and energetic, informed and articulate public that the state serves its proper function, without which it becomes a political means for the pursuit of exclusive elite private interest, which involves domination and oppression. The state will, if not unchecked, will pursue the interests of the powerful if the people remain unorganized and unarticulate. So, to go further into this idea, we can turn to the idea of political legitimacy. That the political legitimacy of coercive state power which is enacted through its laws and their enforcement, is contingent upon the acceptance of the normative justifiability of the law by citizens from within their valid moral conceptions, principles of justice, and social norms. When power is exercised without the consent of those subjected to it, thereby being imposed, it is morally unjust. So, in order for coercive power to be both just and effective, it must be affirmed by the citizenry as justifiable and hence politically legitimate. So the power of society rests in consent to the legitimacy and thereby the justifiability of the coercive power of the state. This highlights the importance of the consent of citizens. Consent means that the people freely endorse the founding values and principles of the government and its laws in light of those values and principles. And such consent renders government justifiable and legitimate. This suggests that the power of society, the power of the people, is consensual. It invokes a consensual theory of power, which understands power as a collective act grounded in mutual agreement. Therefore, valid justification from this perspective is the source of political legitimacy, and that grounds the power of the state. So the power of society rests upon their consent, their capacity for consent, and their agreement based upon the justifiability of the government to its power. In other words, the power of the government of the state is derived from the people, grounded in their consent, and that consent is based upon their agreement, mutual acceptance of the legitimacy of the government. The balance of power between the state, the coercive power of the state, and the power of society, if those two powers are in balance, if there's the right balance between the power of the state and the power of society, that creates a corridor of liberty, as Acemoglu and Robinson have demonstrated. The corridor of liberty, and it's a narrow corridor, is created and sustained through the ongoing balancing of the power of the state and the power of society. If the power of the society is low, as indicated by this graph or figure, then we have the existence of a despotic state, the unchecked Leviathan. If the state is absent, we have power of society, but we have a situation where the state, the government, is so weak that it cannot create the possibility of liberty or injustice. So, in order to create the corridor of liberty, and as we'll see, the corridor of peace, in order to create a just and well-ordered society, which is the objective of peace, as we've discussed earlier in a previous lecture, it requires the balance of power between the state and society, and that balance creates the corridor of liberty. This balance is achieved when there is political legitimacy derived on the basis of consent. The power of society is in a state of balance with the power of the state when it achieves political legitimacy through consent. And this balance of power is contingent upon an informed and politically active citizenry who are capable of engaging in public justification, grounded in their capacity for moral reasoning. And this is a dynamic situation. The state and society must continually exercise sufficient and balanced capabilities in order to maintain their balance of power, so that neither the state nor society dominates. And this balance creates the corridor of liberty, a space within which freedom and liberty can be pursued, and therefore justice, because liberty is a matter of justice. The balance creates a corridor, a space of liberty contingent upon justice, and therefore it can be understood as constituting a sphere of positive peace as a balanced structure of state-society power relations. So here we've come to a definition of the sphere of peace, the sphere of positive peace, that is, peace entailing justice, as a balanced structure of state-society power relations. So that is potentially occurring within a national society. A corridor of liberty and peace, the sphere of peace, can be created through the right balancing of power between the structure of the state and society. And this can be applied not only to individual societies, national societies, but to international and global society as well. And at this level, the state-society power relations enacted internationally between the power of a world order, defined as an array of regimes of international political and legal institutions, and the power of global civil society, grounded in human rights and the norms and principles of global justice. So on the level of international and global affairs, we can project also the possibility of a balance of power between the world order and the body of citizens that make up a global society. To understand this, we need to first explore the idea of political realism, because political realism challenges this possibility of an international society, a global society, the possibility of a balance of power between states and global civil society. And political realism maintains that the relations between nation states are purely political, in the sense that they concern exclusively interest and power, and do not apply or entail any consideration of what is right or good. Hence, a kind of moral skepticism, or a potent moral skepticism, is the hallmark of political realism. And that's based upon two fundamental understandings: that the international arena is an anarchy, a condition wherein there exists no higher legal or moral authority than individual states. And this creates a condition of what Hobbes called a state of nature, which is a war of all against all. So within the context of an anarchy, only power and not law or morality have relevance. That is military power. And also nation states, will act out of exclusive self-interest. They will pursue their interests in the international arena. They will pursue that interest without moral concern for others. Under these conditions, political realism suggests that under these conditions, the only possibility is a negative peace, which is achieved through a balance of military power between nation states, that a continual Cold War exists between nation states, and that what prevents them from that Cold War from erupting into actual military conflict is a balance of power between states, a balance of military power, which, if power is balanced in a military sense, then aggression, it will be too costly for the perpetrator of that aggression, and therefore the nation state will not intervene in the affairs of others out of fear of retaliation. However, implicit in realism are basic fundamental values and principles that suggest, in fact, the possibility of an international society, one grounded in national sovereignty and the duty of non-intervention. So realism asserts a national right to self-determination. That is, it asserts that the nation state has a fundamental right to determine its own interests and to pursue those interests. This right to self-determination, however, entails a correlative responsibility or duty of non-intervention in the affairs of others. If one claims a right to self-determination, then one invokes a duty to respect the rights of others to their self-determination, and that results in a duty of non-intervention in the affairs of others. So both the right to self-determination and the international obligation of non-intervention constitute the core principles of an international society of nation states. And this system of international society is state-centric. It's based in national sovereignty and the duty of non-intervention. And it suggests that only states have standing and not individuals. That states only have rights and duties. Individual citizens in this arena do not have any rights or duties. And that peace is defined here in a negative sense of the absence of interstate war, as well as the existence of international cooperation on economic, cultural, and political fronts. So implicit in realism are two foundational principles: national sovereignty, the right to self-determination, and a duty of non-intervention. And that creates a kind of society, a kind of social order that is international, a kind of world order based upon national sovereignty and non-intervention. It creates a kind of world order. In order to implement this right and duty of states, the right to national sovereignty and the duty of non-intervention, an international world order has been established consisting of a system of institutions, laws, treaties, conventions, and various organizations. It constitutes an international order or a world order. Formal bodies created by states, international bodies created by states for addressing political issues: the United Nations, NATO, the European Union, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, etc., are examples of the institutions of international or world order. World order also includes international regimes that are legal regimes, including the UN Charter, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Geneva Convention, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, Human Rights Conventions, etc. A vast and complex array of international law has been created to regulate the relationships between nation states and to create a world order. And this world order is grounded in the power of individual nation states as well as their collective cooperation within the arena of international relations. One can argue, however, that states do not possess rights in themselves. They only present rights as bearers and representatives of the rights of individuals that comprise them. In other words, the source of state sovereignty or national sovereignty, and thus the parameters of non-intervention, are human rights. The source of sovereignty is individual human rights. And from this perspective, peace can only be achieved through the establishment of a shared legal, moral, and political global order that guarantees the rights of all human beings. From this perspective, international society, that is world order, does not adequately address structural violence, does not adequately address global justice and human rights. The existence of a global civil society suggests that you and I, as citizens, are also global citizens existing within a global civil society, and that we are empowered by our human rights as moral and political powers. And this is parallel to our domestic society that we discussed earlier. And that the power of global civil society, grounded in human rights, can balance the political power of the system of world order created by nation states. And the speculation here is that this balance, the balance between world order and global civil society, creates a sphere, another corridor, wherein positive peace can be pursued and established. And this is depicted by this figure adapted from the narrow corridor. So on the one side we have the political power of the world order, international institutions, and the balance of military power within that order. And on the horizontal axis we have the power of global civil society, the moral and political power of global citizens organized within civil society. And that potentially creates a corridor of positive world peace. And this corridor we can understand as defining the international and global, the world sphere of peace, a sphere of world peace. So to conclude, we have argued that state political power is in a state of balance with the power of society when it achieves political legitimacy through consent. And this balance creates a corridor of justice, positive peace within national societies and between nations in peace. Thus, the corridor or the sphere of peace this corridor constitutes the sphere of peace as a balanced structure of state-society power relations. And this is the main conclusion, that the balance of power between the state and society creates a sphere of peace, and that sphere is constituted by a balanced structure of state-society power relations. The main point of identifying the sphere of peace as a balanced structure of state-society power relations is to suggest that the informed and engaged political participation of citizens is a necessary and fundamental condition for the pursuit of peace and justice. We, you and I, are essential participants from this perspective, or can be essential participants in the pursuit of peace and justice. That our participation is fundamentally important and essential for the pursuit and realization of positive peace. That is, it is the power, the moral and political power of the people, society, that is necessary for the pursuit and establishment of justice and peace. Thank you.